Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books, out loud, while stoned. In this video, we're going to start a new Little Blue Book, and it is Little Blue Book number 873, and it is titled Dwellers on the Ponds, written by Carol Lane Fenton. I believe it has a copyright date of 1925. So, this Little Blue Book is 101 years old, and as you can tell, it's already kind of rough. The cover has already come off. So let's see. Copyright 1925. Here it says, "My thanks are due to Dr. Height C. Moore for permission to reprint the first and the last essays of this booklet, already published in one of the magazines edited by him. They also are extended to Helen West Heller, who has made, particularly for these essays, the woodcut that serves both as their frontispiece and introduction." And I think the next page actually has the woodcut. Oh, it does, and the table of contents. Our table of contents for this Little Blue Book are as follows. Chapter 1, Meeting the Morning. Chapter 2, Dwellers of the Pond. Chapter 3, The Pond in Winter. Chapter 4, The Beaver's Pond. And Chapter 5, Ponds of the Prairie. Then we have a little woodcut print called The Pond, woodcut by Helen West Heller. And there you go, there's the woodcut. Pretty print. And off we go. Chapter 1, Meeting the Morning. There is no more beautiful place in the countryside at which to meet the morning than the pond. The way to it that I know best, and which takes me there the most pleasantly and quickly, lies along the banks of a little creek which flows westward through a pasture just on the outskirts of the town. It leads me along a grass-grown by-street, past the backyards of the outermost fringe of workmen's houses, and as I walk toward the pond, I hear the cooing of early rising doves and the clear bugle of roosters calling for their flocks to awake and begin a new day. The path that takes me down the railway tracks for a short distance, and I meet greasy foundry workers from the night shift and others who, with chattering dinner pails, straggle along their way to the furnaces which must be tended every hour of the day, if other men are to have iron on which to work. They too will meet the morning, but in a haze of smoke, before heaps of coke, or with the clatter of chisels upon the rough faces of the new castings. At last I come to the pond, cutting across lots to it from the railway. Turning to the east, I see the first glow of a sun just rising above the horizon. The distant trees stand out in silhouette above the purple ground, and the flying pigeons make black figures on the blue-white background of the sky. Somewhere, among the willows at the pond's edge, a robin begins to sing, and he is answered by others in the trees along the creek and in the pasture to the north. The crowing of roosters in the poultry yards which I have passed increases in volume, and calls of other fowls come faintly from the town. A phobie whistles among the bushes, and a pair of catbirds begin their whining wrangle that will last until they go back to sleep at night. An old spotted frog, eyeing me from imagined security among the cattails, sends out a doubting "Hmm?" A whistle sounds, and an early morning passenger train clatters down the track, the engineer and I waving hands. Every morning we greet each other as he rushes past, his brakes half set, his whistle screeching the half-mile yard warning. We never have met or spoken. We should not recognize each other if we were to meet in the same room. He sees me and I see him, and we wave hands. Each wishes the other well. and neither knows the other's name or business, and neither cares to. He goes on his way over the prairies with shrieking whistle and clattering wheels. I go mine as silently as possible among bushes and along streams. We are very good friends, that engineer and I. The sun has risen higher, and new birds, roused by the light and the noise of the train, join in the morning song. From the slough comes the melodious voice of the redwings. From the fields, the shrill calls of dick chisels and song sparrows, mingled with the occasional whistle of a meadowlark. A flicker hammers away at a nearby telephone pole, and among the broken muskrat houses, fearsomely bob a pair of white-billed coots. The heat of the day begins to be felt, rousing the insects to their nervous activity, while I kneel on the bank to study some tracks left during the night on the soft mud, and the fat old frog among the cattails watches me suspiciously and says, "Home." And that's the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2, Dwellers of the Pond. The pond lies on the northern outskirts of an Iowa town of 7,000 or more people, one of those small manufacturing communities that have sprung up throughout the Middle West, wherever transportation is fairly good and labor more than fairly cheap. To the south of the pond runs a railroad, along its northern border another, the two meeting in a broad V and then continuing their ways into the town and to the factories upon which the people depend for a living. Between the tracks, the land originally was low and marshy, a typical prairie slough. But grading and excavation for ballast turned it into the broad, shallow basin, which drains slowly into the remainder of the slough that stretches northwestward to the river. Thus, it is the embankments of the railways which actually make the pond, which is a much safer one for water life than most of those whose banks were deposited by the melting ice of Pleistocene glaciers. For these natural ponds have little or no drainage, and none too certain supplies of water, so that in summer they either are dangerously stagnant or forbiddingly dry. My favorite, on the other hand, always has plenty of water, while the drainage assures at least moderate freshness. There is another advantage from the railroads, too. They so isolate the pond that it is good for nothing, and no one is apt to fill it up or lay tile to carry its waters off, thus turning it into gardens or building lots. Often, I approach the pond across the southern of the two railways instead of from the north and east, coming to it through a district of tumble-down sheds and tattered houses, such as surrounds every switching yard, whether in city or village. Crossing the track, I descend a steep bank into what once was a gravel pit, from which material for the embankments was dug. The 6 decades that have passed since its use have allowed the walls to tumble down and become covered with a thick growth of bushes, so that in but one place can the swallows and kingfishers find spots to dig their subterranean nests. The lower margin is fringed with large willow trees, in which dwell countless birds, safely careless of the passing trains and factory whistles, while the basin is filled with water that in spring reaches a depth of 5 feet. In it, as in the shallower part of the pond, there is an abundant and varied population, less brilliant and noisy than that of the trees and cattails, but hardly less attractive to the naturalist who is willing to watch and wait. Down under the water, there are animals quite as interesting as the cicada, as beautiful as the redstart or goldfinch, and as secretive as the sorrel rail. That is that in spring slips among the long grasses and cattails of the pond's more open portion. Desiring to study some of these creatures, I one day dipped my collecting net into the tangle of dead leaves, twigs, and water plants of the pond's border, bringing out a handful of, and we have a drawing of the location of the pond. There you go. As you can see, it is sided by the railroad tracks. And that is a sketch map of the pond. Bringing out a handful of them for examination, on nearly every stick and plant, I found the capsule-like shells of a small brown snail that is common in both ponds and rivers, their surfaces being covered by a film of green algae. Along with them were two of the large, heavily ribbed snails, which are common in the clear creeklet, which skirts my favorite road to the pond, but seldom live in more quiet waters. I never have seen them in the shallower part of the pond, and I take it that their presence in the other section shows that the water was pure and well oxygenated, for otherwise they would have found their way to some more suitable locality. On the shell of one of these snails I found a small patch of jelly-like substance, beneath which showed a network that looked like thin celluloid. This jelly was the bodies of a whole colony of bryozoans, or moss animals, and the celluloid, the covering for their unprotected organs. One may often find such colonies on snails or clams and on submerged branches, particularly where the water is but slightly polluted. A few 100 million years ago, the bryozoans were a mighty race, inhabiting every sea and covering the bottoms with their heavy coralline skeletons, which become fossilized in the accumulating sediment. Not more than a dozen miles from the pond are beds of shale of Devonian age, from which one may collect thousands upon thousands of fossil bryozoans, each fragment of a colony many times the size of the little one on the snail shell. In the limestones and shales of New York, Tennessee, and Michigan are countless species of ancient moss animals, while the hills on which much of Cincinnati is built are largely made up of their stony skeletons. In recent times, the group has fallen into lowly circumstances, and though fairly common in both salt and fresh waters, they have neither the abundance nor variety that were theirs in the past. But the animal population of the pond is far from being made up only of snails and bryozoans. On its surface flit long-legged water boatmen, and occasionally one may find one of the larger aquatic beetles darting here and there for prey. In summer, there are countless wriggling larvae of mosquitoes, of species harmless so far as fevers are concerned, but uncomfortable enough when they come in search of a meal. Above the pond fly the gauze-winged dragonflies, ever in search for something to eat, while in the water their savage-looking carnivorous nymphs may be found during the breeding season. Never have I found a clam, even though they are plentiful in the muddy bottom of the river less than a mile away. Evidently, this restriction of range is less a matter of desire than of necessity, for there is little chance for a larval clam to find its way across dry land, or even sloughs. Occasionally, it is true, one attaches itself to a fish that wanders along some creek to a pond more or less isolated, but evidently nothing of the sort has happened in the pond at which I, for some years, was a regular visitor. However, there is no lack of minnows, since they are not hampered, as are the clams. They may be found in all seasons, either nosing about among the rubbish of the bottom and banks, or treading water out in treading water out in deeper water. That doesn't make sense. For my part, I regard the minnow as suspicious and uninteresting, and never have I been able to get close to one that was warned of my coming and had a good chance to escape. Perhaps this is the reason why I have taken so little interest in them, and cannot even name the genus of the most common species in the pond. To me, one minnow is much the same as another, although I do try to distinguish the young of larger fish, such as carp, suckers, and bullheads, that often swim with their smaller relatives. Throughout spring, summer, and autumn, the leopard frogs which dwell in the pond croak their monotonous, though not unpleasing song. I never have seen a bullfrog in the pond, and don't know of anyone else who has, but the brightly spotted leopard frog is abundant. He is the first pond dweller to appear when ice melts in spring, and he stays out in autumn until the water is frozen so firm of a morning that there clearly is danger in remaining longer away from winter quarters. In May, jelly-like egg masses of the species are common, and a little later one can distinguish the black bodies of the developing tadpoles within the larger translucent mass. Throughout June and July, tadpoles swim about the pond in hundreds, often looking like schools of pot-bellied minnows. Their favorite habit, however, is to lie close to the bank in the shadow of some dead branch or among the dainty fronds of the water plants. Reach into the water and pull out some of this rubbish. There will be a prodigious scurrying away of tadpoles to safer regions, while a wriggling within your grasp will show that some unlucky individual failed to get away and would greatly like to feel water once more. However, he is not in immediate danger of suffocation, and you may hold him in your hand to examine the mixture of fish and frog characteristics without doing damage to more than the tadpole's feelings. Yield to his unspoken entreaties, and off he goes with much wriggling of tail, apparently to let his comrades know all about the adventure, and actually for no purpose whatever except to get away. Repeat the procedure in 10 or 15 minutes, and there will be the same hasty scattering, the same wriggle in your hand, and the same hurried departure of a badly scared tadpole when the plants are returned to the water. At least 3 times I have identified the same individual as victim or repeated captures. Such is the wisdom of the tadpole. He wasn't killed the first time, so the presumption is he will not be the second. His elders, however, are more interesting, more self-composed, and somewhat more intelligent, although they know vastly less than they seem to. Often as I sit on the bank of the pond in a summer evening, I hear that lonesome "whoomph," apparently coming from the center of the pond. Once, when I was young and ignorant of the ways of leopard frogs, I thought this call, actually came from the place it seemed to come from, and puzzled much as to what a frog was doing in water 5 feet deep. But a little sharp watching dispelled that illusion, and now I direct my gaze close to the shore, usually being rewarded by the sight of some patriarchal frog eyeing me suspiciously, and now and then voicing his doubt and mistrust in one of those severe puritanical grunts. If I am in good humor, I let him alone. If not, I throw a bit of wood or stone at him with aim none too accurate. Then, if the frog is a false and untried patriarch, he will disappear into the water with a frightened kashloop, and not another sound will I hear from him. On the other hand, if he is the real thing, he merely cuts short a call and eyes me with triple suspicion before resuming Yet even the patriarch among frogs shows some limits to his courage, or pig-headedness. And a second pebble, sent with better aim than the first, will be sure to vanquish him for the rest of the evening. One water-soaked log near an island in the middle of the deeper portion of the pond is the particular domain of the mud turtles. Actually, of course, these animals are not turtles at all, but painted terrapins. But mud turtles, the boys have named them, and mud turtles they shall remain, in spite of the precise zoologist. There seems to be but one family of them in the pond, but it is built upon pioneer proportions, so that their log sun parlor contains a full baker's dozen when they all are ranged along it. I assume that this log is the only home the animals possess, though I cannot speak of their winter quarters, which I have never tried to discover. Indeed, I never have tried to find out much of anything concerning the ways of this family of terrapins, for they refuse to have anything to do with me. Even in the sunniest and sleepiest of summer afternoons, they remain coldly suspicious, and any attempt to approach nearer than the bank is met by quiet but immediate departure. Evidently, the mud turtle divides animate nature into two classes: turtles and things that are dangerous, and proceeds to keep as great a distance as possible between himself and those not of his kind. The reason for this fearsomeness I have not been able to discover, for certainly the reptile is more fully protected than many a creature of less cautious habit. Nor are its trails shared by its relatives of the land, for the common box tortoise shows fear of neither man nor beast, and will not even close his hinged shell until forced to do so by proddings from boot or stick. Of escape he does not seem to dream, yet he needs it quiet as much as the terrapins. Pardon me. We'll take a break here for hydration. This hydration break brought to you by my friend Maddie. Hydrate, Maddie. One more cough. All right, here we go. Often I have hoped to hear the voice of a mud turtle at home, but my ambition has never been gratified. I frequently have listened to the faint treble croaking of turtles in captivity, and have noticed it as a signal of hunger, but never have heard a wild turtle give voice. Even in print, the call of these animals seldom is mentioned. Although Solomon does remark that the time of the singing bird is come, and the voice of the turtle was heard in the land. It seems certain, however, that Solomon's turtle is a bird. The old world turtle dove, as also is the turtle to whose voice John Bunyan refers. Whether the fault lies with the observer, who seldom gets close enough to a turtle to hear it, or whether the animal itself is to blame, I do not know. But I suspect the latter. And I take some consolation that the famed wisest of men seems to have been of no more successful observer than I in this respect. Aside from the terrapins, reptiles are rare at the pond. I once saw a little chocolate-spotted water snake which wriggled away as fast as it could go. But beyond that, my records for the pond itself do not extend. Among the grasses and bushes of the banks, a garter snake occasionally may be found, but usually he appears to have wandered in by accident from the pasture land northward, whence he is nervously anxious to escape. Perhaps now and then a bull snake comes into the confines of the pond from the same region, but the chances are that so large and slow a serpent would stand small chance of living so close to habitations of men. For the people who live near the pond are like most other folks in this respect, at least. To them, every snake is anathema and must be killed forthwith. In vain, those of us who are interested in preserving the wildlife of the pond talk and write about the harmlessness and virtues of most snakes. Our neighbors kill the poor reptiles just the same. That one or two rare snakes of the region are harmful, and all the rest utterly without power to hurt makes no difference. For seldom does one find a man who can tell a copperhead from a bull snake. It is true that here and there I have found an exceptional person who knows the value of the common snakes and protects them, but the heart of most people are set in their destruction. What the pond lacks in reptiles, it more than makes up in their distant relatives, the birds. The larger willows bordering the one time gravel pit, and the smaller ones which form thickets along the banks of the rest of the pond, form the most populous bird haven in the neighborhood. On a May morning, during the height of the northward migration, every tree is filled with feathered travelers, and I have counted as many as 41 species within the limits of the pond alone. Of these, the warblers are the most numerous. The myrtle warbler, often appearing in hundreds, while other species are represented by smaller flocks. Redstarts dash about hunting insects, and other birds and watering thrushes slip among the branches at the water's edge. Robins always may be counted on, and the chances are that one or two early pairs will be feeding the wide mouths of their first broods by the time the main bulk of migrants arrive on their way north. Bluebirds, too, are early comers, while the red-headed woodpeckers, flickers, jays, and chickadees merely remain over from the winter. The old trees, several of which are partly decayed, offer excellent homes to those birds that nest in holes, although the telegraph poles along the railways offer greater attraction to woodpeckers than do the willows. Probably the branches of the trees hamper the birds in their flight to and from the nest, and perhaps also they make easy the approach of enemies. Of this much I am sure: there are more redheads in the pools than in the willows, and as many flickers, while the bluebirds stay by the trees, and one or two fence posts hollowed out by forgotten generations of woodpeckers. Every summer a pair of kingfishers come to the pond, digging their nest in one part of the high bank which manages to keep clear of weeds by annual landslides of small dimensions. It is not a very safe location, however, for several times I have seen cats prowling about the bank, and once a rat poked his nose within 2 or 3 inches of the entrance of the kingfisher's burrow, with nothing in sight to keep him from making the rest of the climb. I was preparing to frighten the prowler off with a pebble when out dashed one of the parent birds with a savage rush that sent the rat headlong into the nearest burdock patch. Evidently, the kingfisher is quite able to look out for himself, and is capable of a defense that will prevent any ordinary rodent from getting over the 6 long feet from the burrow's entrance to the nest of eggs. This bird, like the mud turtle, believes in families built on its generous proportions of pioneer times. The female lays from 5 to 8 eggs, and sometimes even 9. And since accidents do not often happen in a household so well hidden and guarded, every egg means a future baby kingfisher, into whose mouth must be stuffed an almost endless stream of minnows and small fish. Where the parents get enough food to go around, I never have been able to discover, even though many hours have gone into the effort to do so. Certainly, the minnows of the pond do not make up the diet of the young birds, for during the period of their growth, neither of the parents spends much time in the region where minnows might most abound. Nor do the birds fish a great deal at this season in the open pond, where an occasional sucker or bullhead is to be captured, although later in the summer both of them may spend hours watching its waters from a branch or telegraph wire. From the direction of their flight, I should say that the kingfishers seek food for their broods in the swampy creeks a half a mile or more from the pond where they nest, perhaps going even further away when occasion demands. If this is so, I cannot understand why they do not abandon the pond altogether and dig a new burrow in a gravel bank that is but a few rods from an excellent bullhead pool, thus saving many miles of useless flight. If birds were as intelligent as some nature writers would have them seem, this move would have been made long ago, for there is not a single advantage which the pond possesses over the gravel bank as a home for kingfishers. But so far as I am able to discover, birds do not have very high intelligence, so that truly rational thought is beyond their abilities. On the contrary, habit, instinct, and reflex dominate their mental activities, which may furnish a clue to the kingfisher's choice in a home site. For it is quite conceivable that when the birds first settled at the pond, there was fairly good fishing in its waters, which since then has disappeared. But the habit of nesting in the barren bank did not vanish with the fish, and so the kingfishers have changed their hunting grounds rather than move their burrow to a more convenient location. All this, of course, is purely speculation on my part, and may be as far from truth as black is from white. For all I know, there may never have been good fishing in the pond, and the bird's choice of it as a place to nest may have been due to some factor of which I have the slightest inkling. Quite conceivably, too, it may have been in response to nothing in the environment, a mere causeless whim, such as even we rational human beings indulge in every now and then. Doubtless, there is a reason back of every act of every animal, from protozoan to man. That is no sign that the animal is aware of the cause of its behavior. In the years when I first visited the pond regularly, its most open part contained two large muskrat houses, built mainly of mud and roots brought up from the bottom. Now and then I would see one of their inhabitants, either young or adult, and the increasing frequency of these glimpses seemed to indicate that things were going well in the little colony. Then came the war in Europe, with a great rise in the price of of finished furs, and a corresponding increase in the prices which the town junk dealers paid for raw skins of such small, fur-bearing mammals as the country harbored. Two lads who knew perfectly well that the pond was being kept as a nature preserve decided that conservation and sentiment should not stand in the way of profit, and set out to catch as many muskrats as they could. With the aid of traps, pickaxe, and spade, they not only killed most of the animals, but demolished the houses so that there was no chance for any survivors to keep the colony going. When the ice melted away in the spring, there remained but two disordered piles of rubbish and roots as relics of the muskrat houses, and though I watched carefully, there was not the slightest trace of any of the animals anywhere about the pond. On one of the houses, a pair of coots hollowed out a nest and began to incubate their eggs. At first, they were very nervous, slipping off at the approach of every train and hobbing about fearsomely among the cattails until it had passed. A few rods away, some robins went on concernedly about their business, while on telegraph poles by each railway flickers and redheads nested without the slightest fear. About the muskrat houses were nestling blackbirds, who kept up their chatter from morning to night, caring for neither freight train nor the explosive gas cars of the section gangs, and raising little disturbance, even when I waited among them, examining their nests. But these examples of safety meant nothing to the coots who continued to leave their eggs at every toot of an engine whistle. As a result, all their incubation proved fruitless, and eventually birds slipped away, leaving behind them 7 chocolate-spotted eggs that persistently refused to hatch. Not long afterward, a marauding blue jay proceeded to investigate with view to a meal, but as nearly as I could discover from an observation point on the bank, the results were not much of his liking. By the next spring, the muskrat houses had disappeared entirely, and since that time, none of the animals have ventured to build in the pond. And I think we'll stop there. That seems like a good place to stop for this reading. And let me find a book marker. Let me find a page marker. So this will end part 1, excuse me, of Little Blue Book number 873, titled Dwellers on the Ponds, written by Carol Lane Fenton. Copyright 1925. So, thanks for listening, and join me in part 2.